Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Lokikant.
Hi, good evening, sir. Good evening.
Good evening.
A very good evening to all the participants in this evening session of day 2 of the 3-day international webinar on climate change, human rights and literature, organized by the Department of English and IQAC, Seva, Bharati, Mahavidyalaya, Kapgari, Jhargram, West Bengal, in collaboration with the Department of English, Government General Degree College, Mohanpur, Paschim, Medinipur, West Bengal. Now, in the morning session, we had 2 plenary talks delivered by Dr. Amit R. Vaishya and Professor Pankaj Siksaria. Whereas Dr. Amit R. Vaishya, located the present crisis of climate change within the works of Vandana Singh. Professor Pankaj Siksaria explored the concept of vulnerability and fragility within the ecology of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. This was followed by a paper presentation session which was chaired by Dr. Ujjwal Jana and paper presenters both from West Bengal and outside of Bengal. They presented their papers touching on the themes of the webinar. So without much ado, I now request Sheikh Tariq Ali, Assistant Professor, Joint Convener of this webinar, to kindly introduce our chairperson to the audience. Over to you, Sheikh Tariq Ali.
Hello and good evening. It is really a pleasure to introduce a person who is my teacher in every sense of the word. First of all, I thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation for chairing this session. Dr. JOYJIT GHOSH is a professor Department of English, Vidyasagar University, Midnapore, West Bengal, India. He is a veteran Lawrence scholar, DH Lawrence scholar. His published work include a fair number of articles on DH Lawrence, published in reputed national and international level journals. His book, Imagining D.H. Lawrence, His Mind and Art in Letters, has been published by Author Press in 2012 and reviewed very recently by Susan Reid in the D.H. Lawrence Society newsletter. Dr. Ghosh's research interests include Indian writing in English, Bangla Dalit Sahitya and Translation Studies, Eco-critical Studies, Rabindranath Tagore, Diaspora Studies, and Animal Studies. So I request now, sir, to take charge of the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Tariq, for your kind introduction. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Department of English, Seva Bharati Mahavidyalaya, and of course, the Degree Government College, Mohanpur, and also at the same time, the IQAC of Seva Bharati Mahavidyalaya for organizing a kind of webinar which addresses a burning issue, because this change of climate indeed has put us in a terrible predicament. And so I must tell everyone who is present that we are all privileged to be present here to attend this type of webinar, because you see, why do just exist if the climate continues to change? How could we simply survive on the face of the earth? Okay, after all, we have only one planet to survive on. So since of course we're all hard pressed for time, I don't think I should extend my talk. So I would just like to know from both Tariq and Shomit, that is, how many presenters are there in this very session, and how much time we can give to each and every presenter, so that, because after all, at the end of the session, we have to give some time for the interaction, because the audience would like to put questions, I believe. And of course, the paper presenters also would have the opportunity to interact with the August audience. So how much time can be given to the paper presenters?
Sir, with your permission, the paper presenters are allowed 10 minutes.
10
and
minutes.
There are a total number of 6 papers in these sessions.
Okay.
And should I call up them in terms of their name, or?
Okay, one by one, of course, you can just request them to come and give their presentation. Okay. So it is just now, 7:05. So the first paper presenter can now come and of course give his or her presentation. So who is that presenter? Please introduce.
With the permission of the chair, may I now request Dr. Shatarupa Datta, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, Dinabandhu Andrews College, to present her paper. And the title of the paper is The Psychological Impact of Climate Change on Diverse Exposure Groups.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
So I think she did not join. So you could move to the next paper.
Okay. Since Dr. Shatarupa Datta hasn't attended yet, hasn't joined yet, the next presenter is Dr. Saurabh Pal, Assistant Professor and Head Department of English, Gaurabguin Memorial College, CK Road, Paschim, Medinipur. And the title of his paper is Who Pays the Price? Conservation Pitted Against Environmental Displacement in the Hungry Tide. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
So Dr. Pal, please give a presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, JOYJIT.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Since I just joined, without delaying it more, I start my paper. The title of my paper is Who Pays the Price? Conservation Pitted Against Environmental Displacement in the Hungry Tide. Forced population displacement caused by environmental degradation and climate change has become a gradually increasing phenomenon in the era we are the Anthropocene. These environmental disaster displacement are often placed with other factors like economic vulnerability, discrimination, persecution, exposure to violence, political interference, government policies, and most of all, unsustainable development projects endorsed by. While talking this green climate picture, today's view with environment 360 and of the nature, a landmark book right south. It's not really of humans and human nature that them here. It's a hydropower and economic system of fossil fuel industry. Small enough
just expose that. I think perhaps network is an issue. So could you please check the network, and because there are faults. Okay, as you give your present, there are faults. Okay, so please check. Yeah.
Okay. Can you listen to me properly? Should I continue?
Now we can listen.
With your kind permission, sir, Dr. Saurabh, I request you to disconnect once and then reconnect. I think then the issue will be resolved.
Okay. If it can help, of course, do that, please.
Oh, just give me 1 second. Just 1 second. Listen to me now?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. We can listen
Okay.
to you, but the image is not properly visible.
Okay. Is it visible now?
Okay, it's in a limbo, in a kind of a still. It's better for you if you can turn off the video and then go on reading the paper. In that way, you can avoid this technical problem that you're encountering. Okay.
Okay. Fine. No problem. Okay. I'm just turning off the video.
Yeah.
Okay, now listen to me properly. Hello?
Yes. Please go on. We can listen to you. Please.
Okay, thank you. Okay, fine. Okay, I was talking about McKibben's, and I was quoting from him, and he said that it was our bad luck that this idea that markets solve all problems and that government should be left to wither away crested just at the moment when it could do the most damage. Indeed, with the disappearance of safety nets like welfare policies and state-controlled economy, and with more intense competition for private profiteering at the global level, capitalism now shows its naked and heartless form in shutting off all the opportunities and basic amenities of life from those who do not have the power to buy them. These non-buyers are often those weaker sections of the population that traditionally relied on a harmonious coexistence with nature, drawing their sustenance from the very earth. It is they who remain the most vulnerable to any climate change, whether caused by sudden climate disasters or slow environmental changes brought about by corrosive capitalist activities, destroying the ecological balance. And it is they who are forced to pay the price of any environmental catastrophe, local or and are to be displaced from their homeland. Seva, another noted environment activist, makes a crucial distinction between development and maldevelopment in a seminal book, Staying Alive. According to her, the dominant Western model of so-called progress or development with the associated creation of poverty and dispossession was manufactured to support the Industrial Revolution in Europe and provided chief motivation behind the colonization of a large part of the world. Seva traces the root of this model in the Cartesian concept of nature as environment or a resource, which is, quoting from her, A, inert and passive, uniform and mechanistic, B, C, separable and fragmented within itself, D, separate from man, and E, inferior to be dominated and exploited by man. This anthropocentric way of treating both nature and all other species living in it gradually changed the worldview and lifestyle of people belonging to the ancient that once in a ecocentric living resulted in placement sections of the society, especially still living like small farmers, fishermen, rural population tribes. Seva regards such development that cuts people off the soil and endangers both nature and humanity as maldevelopment. For the maximum benefit of a few, such development snatches away even the human from a great many.
I would request all the other participants to kindly mute their audio during the presentation.
Okay. Am I on?
Please go. Yes, please go on. There was a noise disturbance, hence I decided to cut you.
Okay, thank you.
You're audible.
Okay. Amitabh, the Hungary also the Gun Island, deals with this side of globalization by linking it to the worldwide devastation of environment and the resultant crisis in the lives of the marginalized who are compelled either to accept his offer or be cornered further and further till they become extinct. Because also shows that at the same time how the environmental policies for conservation and protection of nature can also become the displacement of many people who are made to pay the price of the destruction of nature for the luxury and greed of a few. GHOSH has presented the difference of these two worlds through the contrasted characters of Kushum and Pia in the Hungry Tide. Kushum is born and brought up in the country. She is the man of the soil who knows the secret in this place, loves it in spite of its hardship. Her Western counterpart, Pia, NRI scientist from the US, on the other hand, modern conservationist. She has come to the Sundarbans to study and thereby help to conserve endangered species of marine mammals, the Iraboti dolphin. She has a deep concern for its ecology, but this concern is a product for Western education and her field works as a cytologist. Her view of nature is different from Kusum's instinctive understanding of the laws of nature and the ethos of the place that the latter passed as a legacy to her son Fokir too. The topophilia, the love of a natural surrounding turning into a cultural identity that we find in Kusum, is also known in the settlers of Moritz Jaffe's novel. They were also tied on country people from the age of the Sundarbans in Bangladesh. When war destroyed their village, crossed the border and were taken away by the Indian police to a settlement camp in Dandukaranno in Madhya that they felt themselves to an arid wasteland and dreamt of their homeland, which is the Sundarbans. So after making a dangerous journey, they came to Moritchapi, an uninhabited island in the Sundarbans, to settle there. Kushum in this novel becomes one of them in their effort to restart an old way of life and becomes the voice of the refugees in the ensuing clash with the government. The then government of West Bengal was determined to evict the settlers on the ground that Moritchapi was a reserve forest and any settlement there was harmful to the environment. Such models of protection of environment are in conformity with the Western development projects that do not care a fee for the cost paid by this project. These people now driven everywhere where men and women grow the soil. And for generations, they had depended on for subsistence. Their lifestyle was the natural cycle and did not cause her by making resources non-renewable. The modern development projects severed this bond between nature and human beings in the name of progress, and now they were made to pay the price in the name of conservation for the environmental degradation caused by the massive carbon emission for so-called development. This incident puts forward a vital question. Whether strict implementation of such Eurocentric environmental policies is possible in the perspective of a country, India, where pigs, especially those below poverty line, are as ill-fated as animals and struggle for a little place on this earth. GHOSH thus problematizes the environmental issues by linking them with the human aspects. As we find in the case of Mahavidyalaya people, first they are exploited and driven out of their original habitat, and then the Western model of conservation is thrust upon them when they set out to find a new homeland for themselves. Thus, ultimate cost of protecting is paid by those who cause the least have-nots, whose natural habitats and ways of living in close companion were destroyed with the of nature by civil greed. And this plaintive cry of the dispossessed is here put into the mouth of Kush, one of the victims of the Mahavidyalaya incident in this novel, when she speaks not just for herself, but on behalf of all the dispossessed. This quotation is very important, and I find this a clasp of the Hungry Tide. She says, I quote, "Our lives, our existence was worth less than dirt or dust. This island has to be saved for its trees. It has to be saved for its animals. It's a part of a reserve forest. It belongs to a project to save tigers, which is paid for by people from all along the world. Who are these people, I wondered, who love animals so much that they are willing to kill us for them? Our fault, our crime was that we were just human beings, trying to live as human beings always have, from the water and the soil. This is how humans have always lived, by fishing, by clearing land, and by planting the soil. What we find in this remote archipelago of the Sundarbans is true in the global perspective also. The developed countries that are more responsible for the regeneration of environment and take the highest benefit of the Industrial Revolution also try to evade the results of environmental disasters as much as possible by using their advanced technology and wealth. Similarly, it is the rich who use the appliances like air conditioner, refrigerators, or cars and make excessive use of the fossil fuels like coal and petroleum, whereas the poor suffer their environmental effects. We find arguments for and against the case in the debate between Kanai and Pia over the killing of Fakir and other villages. While Pia, the NRI ecologist, speaks of the horror of this act, Kanai points at the other side of this horror, that the people, the poor local inhabitants of the lands are compelled to face being killed by the tigers every day. Kanai points out the city of the rich of and the Western who their predicament of the civilized people brought to have any voice wrong. However, Pia's reply to this also is the human factored with the endeavor of the conservation of nature. And Pia says, I am quoting, "Just suppose we crossed that imaginary line that prevents us from deciding that no other stars except our. Do you think it will stop at that? Once we decide we can kill off other species, it will
sorry
be
to
people."
interfere, Dr. Shorappal, but you need to sum up.
People, you are
If you could shorten your paper and draw your conclusion.
okay. Now I'm just coming to my conclusion.
Okay.
Okay. I'm just coming to my conclusion right now. Okay. So Pia is talking about exactly that kind of people that Kanai is talking about, people who are unnoticed. But at the end of the novel, and that is also, that Pia, the wild conservationist, emerges with a changed standpoint at the end of the novel. Though still committed to the cause of environment and conservation, focused death in the cyclone at the end, awakens her to the toll that environmental degradation takes on the lives of the poor folk dependent on nature, and she decides to carry on conservation projects only in consultation with the poor local fishermen, who has not placed the burden of conservation on those who are least responsible for the destruction of nature and at the same time the most vulnerable to afford it. In this novel, thus, we find a brilliant representation of the ways of the modern globalized world where conservation and well-being of nature are unfortunately pitted against issues of environmental displacement, and those who are next to nothing, those who have next to nothing are to pay the price of saving the earth. The novel thus reminds us once again of another pithy comic, Bill McKibben, in the aforementioned McEwen said, I am quoting, the iron rule of climate change is the less you deposit, the more and the quicker you suffer. Thank you. Hope I have made my point clear.
Thank you, Shourav, for a very interesting
That's all from
paper. Particularly, you have concentrated on Hungry Tide, a very representative novel of Amitav Ghosh. And we'll all know that progress, development, quote unquote, they're all very problematic words indeed. And particularly when the evil of capitalism is at the center of the discourse. And as I was listening to your presentation, I got to understand that why, we should talk about the third world environmentalism. Because at any cost, we have to resist the Eurocentric notion of
Exactly, sir.
Progress and even conservation, because you have rightly pointed out that is what we have to take note of, that is a human aspect. Yeah. When, the conservation of tiger is more important than taking care of human beings, this is terrible. This is awful. So thank you, Shourav, for this presentation. Now I would request Rick to give us an idea who would be the second paper presenter.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Next one is a joint paper presentation by Mr. M. Titius, if I'm not wrong, in terms of pronunciation, and Dr. Y. Vedya. Both of them are from VHN Sentikumara Nagar College, Viruddhanagar, and the title of their paper is Climatic Variations in the Wake of Human Impingement in Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods. And before I request them to present their papers, I would also request our participants to kindly mute their audios to avoid any noise disturbance. Your cooperation is highly solicited. Thank you.
Yeah, and also restrict the presentation to 10 minutes. Okay, please. Yeah.
Sure, sir. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are audible.
You're audible. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Shall I share my PPT,
Yeah,
sir?
please.
Okay. 1 minute, sir. Is my screen visible, sir?
Yes, it's visible. You can go on.
Okay, sir. Okay. So good evening, everybody that are present in this platform. First of all, I thank the organizers for giving me the chance to partake in this program. So let me start my presentation. The title of my paper is Climatic Variations in the Wake of Human Impingement in Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods. So I would like to begin my presentation with the questions that have been bothering me. That is, why did the famous actor named Leonardo DiCaprio in his first Oscar Award acceptance speech said, climate change is real and it is happening right now? And why did the school-going girl Greta Thunberg, an young climate activist, addressed in the UN Assembly and asked that daring question, how dare you in front of the world leaders, and talked about the global warming and the consequences of climate change. Now, why do I tell you this? Because the many leaders across the world, especially the former US President Donald Trump, believes that climate change is hoax, global warming is a lie, and it is just a money-making industry. He has also said, I'm freezing in New York, where the hell global warming is. So my goal with this presentation is to prove that climate change is real and the human activities are the main reason for the climate change events. So I have taken a familiar travel writer from the same American background, and he proves that climate change is real, and he discusses about the consequences of the climate change that is prevailing in America. And it is also very dangerous to the world. Bill Bryson is an American travel writer. A Walk in the Woods is his 7th travelogue book. In this book, he describes his hike along the familiar Appalachian Trail. The trail runs more than 2,100 miles that stretches along the east of the United States, connecting 14 states. This long trail is also called the granddaddy of the long hikes. Along the trail, Bryson found some of the threats that are posing against the Appalachian ecosystem. Encroaching development, acid rain, pollution are some of the threats to the Appalachian ecosystem, but the most serious issue he comes across is the climate change. Unfortunately, climate change is gradually destroying the Appalachian Trail's magnificent sceneries. As a result, many people, including Bill Bryson, decides to cross the Appalachian Trail before it is further degraded by the climate change. So the US president said there is no climate change in New York, but there is a climate change in America, I think. Today, the climate change is the world's most serious issue, and it is the most serious threat. Climate change poses a threat to both humans as well as animals' survival. Droughts, hurricanes, rising sea levels, melting glaciers, and warming oceans are just a few of the consequences of the climate changes in the earth. So now the question is, who is the reason behind the climate change? As I rightly pointed out before, it is the human beings. The same is pointed out by Bill Bryson in this novel. According to Bryson, certain human activities are the main cause for the climate change. He mentions that the people cut down the trees along the Appalachian Trail to widen the streets and build concrete walls. He says like this, that Appalachians alone lost 4 billion trees, a quarter of its cover in a generation. So what I come to say is, when trees are cut down, much of the carbon that has been stored in the trees is released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, CO2. In this way, deforestation contributes to global warming, and this is the main reason for the climate change. Then in an article I found in the Hindu newspaper, there Ananda Krishnan writes in his article, he says, human activities were unquestionably the principal drivers of changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere. In other words, the climate change. Next threat Bryson found along the trail is the acid rain. Acid rain is one of the greatest threat to the Appalachian ecosystem. How did the acid rain form? Man-made emissions of greenhouse gases since the industrial era were altering the climate system, raising average temperature globally. These gases break down into their respective acids into the atmosphere and are deposited on the ground as acid rain. It causes threats to the ecosystem of Appalachian Trail. Bryson is afraid that acid rain may contribute to the emergence of climate change and threaten the Appalachian Trail. Acid rain has noticeable effects in aquatic areas also. He says the loons are disappearing everywhere because their lakes are dying from acid rain. Loons is an aquatic bird. Because of the acid rain, the aquatic bird species are in the danger of extinction. So Bryson come across variety of weather conditions along the trail. The weather changes suddenly on all the sections of the Appalachian Trail. The rising temperature in the forest gives troubles to the travelers who hike along the trail. He describes the heat that are prevailing in the Appalachian Trail as oven-like heat. Bryson felt as if the trees and foliage were breathing with a hot vegetative breath. Bryson and his friend Coates sweated helplessly and drank unusual quantities of water, but they couldn't stop being thirsty. He makes a point that the Appalachian Trail is in the condition of becoming savanna, yet that is a dry area. The Appalachian Trail is in the condition of becoming savanna if the global temperature rises by 4 degrees Celsius. He says, I quote, if the global temperature rises by 4 degrees Celsius over the next 50 years, as is evidently possible, then the whole Appalachian wilderness below New England could become savanna. Already trees are dying in mysterious and frightening numbers. So these are some of the environmental issues that he quotes in his book. These are the environmental issues that falls behind climate change. But there are also public health problems that are prevailing behind climate change. So we can put like this. The climate change is not only an environmental crisis, but also a public health crisis. How? Human-caused climate change has a variety of effects on human health. It may lead to many diseases and viruses. Bryson, in this book, A Walk in the Woods, lists out many diseases and viruses that lurks in the Appalachian woods. So the most dangerous, he discusses about the most dangerous virus that are prevailing in the Appalachian woods, that is hantavirus. This virus mice and rats, and it affects the respiratory system of the humans and eventually to death. Bryson notes that in 1993 alone, a single outbreak of hantavirus had killed 32 people in the southwestern United States. It is also happening in America, maybe not in New York. Thus, the climate change brings a great loss to the human life. So it is undeniable that changing climate will result in more viral disease outbreaks in the future world. Coronavirus is an best example. Due to the climate change, the earth may face extreme weather problems also. Extreme cold weather poses a threat to humans as well. The most serious danger to the hikers on the Appalachian Trail is hypothermia. Hypothermia is a disease caused by the extreme cold weather. It happens when the body temperature drops below 95 degrees and the body's heat is lost faster. Bryson details the plights of the many Appalachian hikers and how many of them had succumbed to hypothermia. So it is obvious that the human activities are increasingly influence the climate and the temperature of the globe. Because of their activities, the human itself getting the problems in return. So to ameliorate such situation, certain actions must be performed. The bottom line is to reduce the man-made emissions of greenhouse
Sorry to interrupt,
gases.
but kindly sum up.
Yes, sir, I'm going to sum up. Compared with the period of 1850 to 1900, the increase in the global surface temperature for the decade 2011 to 2020 is estimated as 1.09 degrees Celsius. It is an indication of how much the world has warmed. So what I want to stress from this presentation is, what I want to say to the world is, it is the elites, the rich, who damage the planet using various artificial techniques, but whereas the climatic repercussions affect the poor more. By money power, the rich escape the consequences, the repercussions, but the poor have to face the unbearable climatic conditions, leading to physical discomfort on the one hand, and the loss of livelihood, leading to the financial infirmity on the other hand. Thus, the climate change deepens the social inequalities and manufactures poverty. People say that a mother doesn't discriminate between her children, but it appears the mother nature is unkind towards her poorer children. The United Nations Climate Change Conference of 2021, also known as COP26, you may all know that was held in Glasgow, Scotland. The countries gathered in the Glasgow not only to discuss about how to limit the global warming, but also how to adapt to the warmer world and cope with the effects of climate change that are presently taking place. So many scientists keep on saying that we are already experiencing doomsday scenarios that has been said by many climate scientists. So they discussed in that conference that the world's biggest carbon dioxide producers should reduce their carbon emissions. The United Nations is the world's leading producer of carbon dioxide. China ranks the second and India the third. So Hence, the countries must cut their greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. If this target is not achieved, climate change will continue to cause ecological disasters and public health difficulties in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, William, for an engaging presentation. You have rightly pointed out that, yeah, climate change is a reality, and global warming, again, is a reality. And though you have not consciously used the word Anthropocene, obviously your presentation borders on the issue of the Anthropocenic awareness. And as you were, giving the line that the loons are disappearing, the lakes are dying from acid rain, it sounded very terrible.
Yes.
And I also learned that very loaded word from you, that is savanna, because I didn't know that. That is, again, a sense of dryness, which is, of course, encircling us.
Yes, sir.
Again, it's a terrible picture that, in your own way, you have evoked in front of us. So, thank you for your interesting presentation, William.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Rick, who is the next paper presenter?
The next paper presenter is Ananta Ghosh, a lecturer in English, Language and Literature, Gurukul Education and Management Studies, Bengaluru. And the title of his paper is Plastic, Plastic Everywhere, Analyzing Craig Santos Perez's Age of Plastic in the Era of COVID-19. Kindly proceed, Mr. Ananta Ghosh.
Yeah, hi. I'm not Ananta, it's Ananta.
I'm terribly sorry. I'm sorry that I got it.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. So yes, without further ado, I would like to first present my screen. I would be presenting the poem. So please let me know if it's visible or not. Yes, so can you see the poem on screen?
Yes, it's visible and you can continue.
Okay. So yes, good evening, everyone. My topic is Plastic, Plastic Everywhere, Analyzing Craig Santos Perez's Age of Plastic in the Era of COVID-19. So yes, now since the beginning of the year 2020, we all have been fighting the deadly virus, which has caused an enormous damage to health systems and economies all over the world. Lockdowns and stay-at-home measures have been issued, and masks, gloves, PPEs, headgears, and sanitizers have become mandatory. But the very material which actually protects us from the deadly virus is also contributing to some serious environmental degradation. Recent studies suggest that global consumption of masks and gloves in 2020 was around 69 billion units per month. Along with medical waste, there was also an increase in plastic used for packaging and food takeaways. Now, all this debris, it actually ends up in landfills and finally makes way to the oceans. There is also the problem of microplastics and nanoplastics, which are entering the food chain, contributing up to 30% of the plastic patches which are formed in the oceans. And some of them are as big as the size, as big as the US state of Texas. So yes, now back in 1957, Barth in his mythologies had talked about a very important thing. Okay, like he had focused on how the very itinerary of plastic will give humans the euphoria of prestigious freewheeling through nature. This very affordable material and items made out of it has given people new sense of consumer identity and has ushered in a new era of material freedom. The stated poet, Craig Santos Perez, he is the Comoro eco-poet, and he is a native of Guam, an island which is part of Micronesia and a territory of the United States. And he highlights how plastics are deeply embedded in our contemporary life through this particular poem. He shows how this ubiquitous pharmacon-like object gives and sustains life while also causing destruction. Now, for a long time, he had actually witnessed what plastic does to the delicate ecosystems and living creatures. It tears apart the insides of the birds, animals, and other living creatures, including us, humans, in the form of heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. So yes, coming to the word plastic, it actually comes from a Latin phrase, plasticus, meaning capable of shaping, and the Greek word plastikos with a K, meaning ability to be shaped. The poet shows how it helps in prenatal care and birth, and provides us with nourishment and keeps food warm and water fresh for us. Now, what is particularly important over here is the wide usage of plastic in hospitals. It is the most preferred material for IVs, nasal tubes, and cannulas, and so much more. For this, I would like to refer to Jody A. Roberts' essay. He has written an essay called Reflections of an Unrepentant Plastiphobe. And there he talks about how plastic has introduced bisphenol A and other endocrine disruptive chemicals in our bodies. It previously never existed, actually. In case of pregnant women, it becomes even more critical because the delicate process of the development of the embryo, where hormones constantly flow from the mother to the fetus, to the baby, can get affected with too much exposure to such chemicals. Perez's poem actually begins with plastic probes. If you can look at the poem, you would see that in the very first line he's talking about probes, okay? And his poem actually begins with plastic probes, which doctors use for USGs to help us give a clearer picture of the embryo. And Roberts, at the same point of time in his paper, talks about food items like strawberries and such others, which, and other several toxic objects which we casually use in our daily lives. And all of this actually makes us wonder that whether we at all have a choice when it comes to using plastic. Now, in the poem's earlier versions, other usages of plastic are also stated, like how it forms cables and clothes, ropes and nets, and even stops bullets. But Alison Cobb's Plastic, an autobiography, her work, it brings to light how polyethylene is one of the major components in the making of atomic weaponry. And this further suggests the irony that the material poses. I mean, we all know about plastic explosives as well, right? So yes, now according to Perez, plastic is a perfect creation, and he uses this particular phrase in the poem because it never dies, unlike the organic bodily processes and capacities it facilitates. He lends human-like qualities to this non-human material when he says how empty it must feel birthed, used, then disposed by us. And it goes on and it ends in this particular line, like how free it must feel when it finally arrives to the paradise of the Pacific Gyre, far from us, its degrading makers. It's almost like he's lending a human-like quality to this non-human object, okay? The poet also wishes his daughter could also inherit immortality, survive the wasteful hands of humans, and inherit a great future, like plastic, which has not only become an integral part of our lives, but also, as per the author Margaret Ronda, who is actually a professor at UC Davis, has stated in her paper on Perez's poem that plastic has become an intimate container for and enabler of reproductive futurity. And that is what, Perez actually highlights, particularly focuses on his poem. Talking about all of this, we also need to discuss a bit about the structure and the form of the poem also, because that is very significant. Now, right after the Second World War, a lot of experimentation was taking place in American poetry regarding form, material, and process. So the post-war poets focused on the development of poetic form as an effect of the perceptual encounter with materials, and they tried to make sense of these processes by connecting them to broader ecological dynamics. And according to Charles Olson's obviously seminal essay, Projective Verse, poetry is a process of composition by field, and writing a poem is a kinetic experience of shaping and being shaped by the materials at hand. When we are stating this, it would obviously be correct for us to say that most of the post-war poets have adopted Coleridge's idea of plasticity of poetry, because in Coleridge, plasticity is a universal principle of formation that links artworks with natural things, and each moment of artistic creation with the dynamic unfolding of organic life. So while some writers have actually focused on linking poetic form and natural materials linking poetic form and natural materials like words, plants, etc. Paris has basically focused and associated climate change, pollution, and toxicity with the form. The short lines, the long dashes that you would find in his poem, the metonymic movement among objects and processes facilitated by plastic, and the figurative emphasis on motion and prosthetic activity all points towards its own act of poesis and to poetry's broader plasticity as an art form. And if we think about it much more, we would find that both poetry and plastic actually share the ability to reflect dimensions of physical being. And both of them have this particular characteristics that they continue to live on in unexpected manner. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt, but you need to conclude.
Yes. I would obviously conclude. And also regarding the italicized lines, we also can note one particular thing, like if we go through those lines, we would find that both of them, like each stanza has italicized lines, and both of them appear to be like pros and cons. Okay, we can consider those lines as the pros can be what our petrocapitalist consumerist culture tells about us. Tells us about plastic. And the cons can be considered as coming from activists, organizations, and research studies which try to bring to light the ill effects of this object. And also, plastic is definitely our culture's gift to the world. So when we are talking about this, we also need to consider and focus on the politics of plastic, like how and why we prefer it over any other object, okay? And why simple boycotts and campaigns like no more plastic would never be enough to stop this entire thing, because no plastic campaigns are rampant, but most of them have been organized or are organized by organizations who are itself thriving on the production of plastic, while at the same point of time they are actually putting the blame on the individuals, okay, like for using it and dumping it on streets. Also, there is this particular tendency of the global north to consume more and to dump the waste on the global south, which makes matters obviously much more worse. Now, to sum up, I would like to talk about one particular thing which is very important, that in literary and cultural theory, we mostly need to focus about how nature is no longer pure and perfect. Like, we need to ditch our quest for organic truth and come to terms with the fact that in 21st century, there exists no place untread by humans. The sea, which has been, which has stood as a metaphor for an inexhaustible storehouse of goods, both in literature and in reality, it needs to be recognized as a body being ravaged for extraction of capital. Sea trash needs to be recognized and ought to flow in novels, poetries, and all other art forms. And Paris's poem serves this particular purpose. And also, he addresses some key questions, like in his poem, like, will plastic make life possible? And at the same point of time, he's urging us somewhat to rise above the dichotomies of plastic, that of plastic being a protector and that of a destroyer, and tells us that it is us who can decide its future, okay? And in his particular article called Our Sea of Plastic, he's actually saying that, I'm quoting him, the plastic ocean is in us. It molds our bodies and stories. The poem proves that if you are reading its currents of words, then you have survived, and it is not too late to reshape our future. So yes, with that, I would like to end my paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you for a very engaging presentation. Yeah, the paper is indeed rightly in tune with the thrust of the webinar. As I was listening to the paper, I was reminded of that book by John Festina, Can Poetry Save the Earth? And of course, the critic tells us that, yeah, poetry can save the earth. Okay. So, yeah, it's high time when we should say no to plastic, because plastic never dies. Yeah. So, yeah, your paper has a strong theoretical premise for which, of course, I should congratulate you, and of course a thorough understanding,
Thank you.
appreciation of the poetry that you have chosen for the elaboration of your argument. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, the next presenter is Dr. Abra Pal, postdoctoral fellow, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, National Institute of Science Education and Research, Bhubaneswar. And the title of her paper is Disaster, Displacement and Migration in Shai Montgomery's Spell of the Tiger, The Man-Eaters of Sundarbans, and Amitabh Ghosh's Amritite and Gun Island. You may proceed, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Please allow me to switch off my camera so there will be no internet issues.
Yeah, please.
And I will also share my screen. Please let me know if it is visible. Uh-oh. Give me a second, please. Yes. Is it visible?
No,
Yeah,
ma'am.
it's
Is
not,
it visible?
no.
No?
No, ma'am. Yes.
Yeah, it's coming.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, okay. Now?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I think we have a paucity of time, so I will skip many parts from my paper. The title of my before beginning, I thank you, Chair Professor Dr. Ghosh, the conveners, and particularly Dr. Mighty for giving me this opportunity. So the title of my paper is Disaster, Displacement and Migration, and I have studied Shai Montgomery's Spell of the Tiger, Amitabh Ghosh's two representative novels, Hungry Tide and Gun Island, in this paper. So to begin with, the topic of climate disaster and climate migration has received considerable attention in the academia. Contemporary works of fiction and non-fiction reflect on the themes such as migration, migrant agency, climate disaster, and human rights, etc. Novelists and writers have problematized many urgent and controversial topics while narrating their stories related to climate change, or in their sci-fi fiction, what we call. So this paper, particularly paper, adopts the comparative and critical perspective with a focus on the natural disasters like cyclones, climate change and climate conflicts, and involuntary displacement. This paper attempts to examine a more inclusive convergence of disaster studies, eco-criticism, and climate migration discourse. Following this line of thought, this paper reads these three contemporary works of fiction and non-fiction: Hungry Tide, published in 2004, Gun Island, published in 2019, and Spell of Tiger, published in 2016. These three texts are the representative texts to demonstrate this particular convergence of theory or this theoretical perspective. So now because of time, I'm skipping the literature survey and the theoretical digging, which is very extensive, because I have proposed a convergence of three different theoretical perspectives: disaster studies, climate migration discourse, and eco-criticism. So I'm going to the second part, which is the textual analysis of these three texts. So first we begin with Ghosh's work and the climate disaster, the cyclones. Ghosh's works depict a fascinating and realistic documentation of severe tropical cyclones like Bhola cyclone of 1970s, Ayla of 2009, and Spell of the Tiger narrates the events related to 1988 super cyclone and the ecological effects of the disasters. Like this quotation is from Gun Island. I'm not going to read the whole one, but the major parts is written that the Vola cyclone later came to be known as the, in terms of casualties, the Vola cyclone was the greatest natural disaster of the 20th century. The toll is conservatively estimated at 300,000 lives lost, but the actual number may have been as high as 500,000. This next quote is also from Hungry Tide, and this is the part of Nirmal's diary. And these are the words of Horen, who says that in 1970, during the Agunmukha cyclone, if you had seen, this would not seem a storm-like storm at all. So Nirmal and Horen, they faced a storm. And during that time, Horen described the Bhola cyclone as Agunmukha. I don't know how the scholars interpret, but I think he meant that it's all consuming, nothing can escape it. Again, going back to Hungry Tide, this is the description of the cyclone Horen faced. And the important lines are that in the quotation, there was no formal warning system in those days, and the storm had taken them completely by surprise. So this is the element that we find that when GHOSH describes the 2009 Ayla cyclone in his work, that how the death toll and the range of devastation was less because of this formal warning system. This is again from quotation from Nirmal's diary, the first part. And here Nirmal has described how are the impact of the cyclone on human being. And when I make a comparison with Cy Montgomery's Spell of the Tiger, these lines will automatically resonate with Cy's lines. So I am reminded of the quote, I am reminded of the moments before the coming of a cyclone when you have barricaded yourself into your dwelling and have nothing else to do but wait. So waiting for the disaster is one of the predicament of the people, not only the people, but also the new non-human species residing in this coastal ecoregion. And the second quote from Hungry Tide, the last lines are very much important. It is the question that GHOSH has posed in his writing. Did nobody know about the Tide country's history of a catastrophic cyclone? I'm tempted to quote Kalyan Rudra and Jyotirindra Lahiri. They have done a very wonderful scholarly work. Obviously, it's in Bengali, Bharatiyo Sundorbon Ekti Bhougolik Ruprekha, published in 2021 by Ananda Publishers. And here, Rudra and Lahiri have quoted that how many, what is the, like the extensiveness of the cyclone-induced disaster in this region. They have stated that during the time period of 1901 to 2010, there were 367 low pressures, 68 cyclones, and 77 severe cyclone storms, what they call in as SCS. So we can see that this region is continuously facing all kind of environmental catastrophe. Going back to Gun Island again, this is the context of cyclone Ayla, which struck Sundarbans in 2009. And the lines are important here that mass evacuation has been planned in advance because there was a warning system. And millions of people were moved to safety in both in Bangladesh and in India. And the casualty count was surprisingly low in comparison to 1970 Bhola cyclone. This is the quotation from Spell of the Tiger. Here, Sai has talked about his friend Rothins, who was a forest officer and had gone to that place for tiger census. His experience of the cyclone of 1988, which mainly struck Bangladesh, but West Bengal was not out of the coastal region of West Bengal was not out of its effect. So Rothin lost his friend, and the important lines here shows that at 6 p.m. it was cold and raining hard, and the cyclone's wind speed has gathered to about 60 miles per hour. And look at the last line of this quotation. By 8 p.m., the wind speed had reached more than 110 miles per hour. So we can see the effect of the cyclone. And this is the next quote, which like resonates with Nirmal's what I will say, his sense of the storm. So Sai's friend Eleanor was somehow lost in the storm. It was a simple storm, but even then, Sai and her friend Eleanor was very much frightened, and they were helped by one of the fishermen called Girindro. So Eleanor took shelter with the other women and the children of the village. They were staying in Girindro's house. And the last line says the children were crying and everyone kept saying cyclone. So they were remembering the cyclone of the 1988. So these people in coastal region are continuously in the fright of being swallowed up by the natural disaster. I think I'm running out of time. Quickly, I will sum up this. So with this, we come to the second part, which is climate-induced migration. The second thing that I have discussed in my paper. So definitely GHOSH's work presents the displacement after natural disaster. So in this quote, we can see that there is a climate-induced migration after the ILA. But I have dealt particularly in this paper about the non-human species, how their migration was affected by the climate change and the climate-induced disaster. Obviously, we cannot like overlook the Moridjapi incidents, and we can designate it as a future of climate-induced migration, because Bhola cyclone induced that climate migration in Moridjapi and the climate refugees from Bangladesh to India. But particularly here, I have dealt with the migratory patterns of different animals in this region and how they are affected by climate change. So Pia is an ecologist, and she has stated that animal migration is very, very natural. But look at the last lines. I have quoted, but animal migrations are being hugely impacted by climate change. So nothing is surprising now. I'm sure we will see more of these intersecting events in future. So we cannot, like Professor Seksaria said today morning, that this is a kind of tripod. Once you remove the one part, the whole system is disrupted. So I think climate change is not an individual event. It is associated with many things: species extinction, habitat destruction, sea level rise, and so many things to say. So this is also from Gun Island, where Pia has talked about the migration pattern of the Ganges dolphins. And the important lines are that their migration pattern is affected by sea levels rise, flow of fresh water, which is diminished, and the increase of salinity. And so these animals, they are what I will say, quoting Barbara Kingsolver, changing their flight path. They are changing their migrating pattern, and they are going towards more not complete extinction. So here comes the species extinction, which is like one of my foray. I think I am running out of time, so I will quickly.
Sorry to conclude. Please make your
yes. 1 minute. Give me 1 minute. Thank you. So I will come back to Amitabh Ghosh, as he said that my ancestors were ecological refugees long before the term was invented. So to conclude, it can be stated that these three texts, raise important questions about disaster, climate migration and fictional presentation of those things, and encourage the readers to reimagine what GHOSH actually meant by the Great Derangement. And with that, I stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pal, for again a very interesting presentation on disaster studies, particularly as you have taken into consideration three very important texts where the representation of the disaster is very much available. And not only for that, you also attempted a sound theoretical framework
Yes.
that what has added value to your paper. And what interested me most as I was listening to your presentation is this very idea of the climate-induced migration.
Right.
This is something which is very interesting, very interesting. Altogether, of course, you more or less consider on the cyclone, various kinds of cyclone which affected people, particularly the marginal groups. Okay, because the rich people are not affected. Okay, they always remain safe and secure. But the
Right.
marginal people, they are, of course, the worst affected people, of course. And so they are doomed to migrate from one place to another. Okay. So thank
But,
you very much. Yeah, please.
But in my work, I have shrewdly bypassed that eco-politics section
Yeah.
rather than more concentrating on the disaster aspect.
Yeah. So they are
Thank you.
ecological migrants. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We cannot omit, but
Yeah. I believe that your paper again will, provoke questions if you of course find time.
definitely.
Thank you, Dr. Paul, once again, and I would request to
Yes, sir.
announce.
The next presenter is Dr. Pooja Joshi, Assistant Professor, Department of English, University of Rajasthan. And the title of the paper is Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, Narratives of Planetary Experience and Climate Change from Northeast India. Kindly proceed, ma'am.
Okay.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Good evening to the esteemed chair and everybody present on this virtual platform. The title of my presentation is just a second.
Do you have a PPT, ma'am?
No, sir. It's just
Okay.
an oral presentation that
Okay.
I'm making. So thank you, Dr. Methi, for giving this opportunity to join this webinar. And the title of my presentation is Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, Narratives of Planetary Experience and Climate Change from Northeast India. So I'll be, because of the paucity of time, I'll be just making a short argument in the beginning of the paper, a brief theoretical build on which I argue my point. And then I'll just mention very briefly two or three of the fictional narratives. I mean, the short stories of the Northeast Indian writers that I have taken actually into the discussion. Briefly, I'll touch upon that, and then I'll sum of the argument. So, sense of place and sense of planet, narratives of planetary experience and climate change from Northeast India. Climate change has become a stark reality of the present times. It is happening everywhere, unbound by the spatial and temporal dimensions. The vacillating impact of such a global crisis equally demands multiple and concurrent scales in order to accurately comprehend the complexity of the problem. Borrowing the title of my paper from Ursula Hayes's book, Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, The Environmental Imagination of the Global, where she proposes the concept of eco-cosmopolitanism, this article aims at reflecting upon the globalization of the present eco-catastrophes, musing upon the local and the global scale impact of the climate crisis. Now, Hayes argues that the deterritorialization of the local knowledge is not always detrimental, rather can open up new avenues into ecological consciousness. Giving consideration to a deterritorialized environmental vision, my paper attempts to probe into the writings of two Northeast writers, Temsula Au and Mamang Dai, and the way their fictional world deals with ecological concerns, climate change, and human rights. In providing a deeply humane account of the people's response to the global crisis, along with the poignant account of the impact on a planetary scale, The issues of migration, displacement, identity crisis, and ethnicity are highlighted. Both Au and Dai in their works contextualize the micro-geographically bounded human experience and memory within the larger context of the global Anthropocene, thereby calling for a sense of planet along with a sense of place which get along with each other. The fictional narratives by Ao and Dai involuntarily transport the readers from witnessing the climate crisis on a local scale to a broader global scale, challenging Tim Clark's notion of scale effects within quotes that, and I quote from Clark, in relation to climate change are confusing because they take the easy daily equations of moral and political accounting and drop into them both a zero and an infinity. Unquote. It is evident that as the impact of such a global crisis differs according to perspectives, one requires multiple and concurrent scales to accurately comprehend the scope and complexity of the environmental issues. Simon Levin, in his article titled The Problem of Pattern and Scale in Ecology, unquote, states that, and I quote, when we observe the environment, we necessarily do so only on a limited range of scales. Therefore, one perception of events provide us with only a low dimensional slice through a high dimensional cake, unquote. Being a deterritorialized global crisis that is unbound by the spatial and temporal dimensions, climate change demands global forms of understanding. With the rise of globalization as an organizing intellectual term in the early 1980s to the mid 1990s, concepts such as transnationalism and cosmopolitanism began to take priority. In the present times of a defining climate crisis that has rendered us powerless, Ursula Hughes argues and urges to develop an idea of eco-cosmopolitanism or, within quotes, environmentally oriented cosmopolitanism that involves actually deterritorialization or detachment of cultural routines, identities, and epistemologies from their ties to place, enabling better understanding of how social and ecological systems function within larger global networks. Based on Hiyes's concept of eco-cosmopolitanism, I quote, an attempt to envision individuals and groups as part of planetary imagined communities of both human and non-human kinds, unquote. This paper aims at analyzing the relationship between the local and the planetary environments as portrayed in Ao and Dai's short stories. The tales beautifully depict that, something what Ursula Hieses calls, within quote, a cultural moment in which an entire planet becomes graspable as one's own local backyard, unquote. However, at present, Northeast writings also reveal that the authors from the region have been deeply concerned with the extremely important issues of, not just the earlier ones like ethnicity and violence, which emerged beautifully on the global scenario, or rather the national one in the 1980s. Rather, they now address issues like climate change, deforestation, environmental degradation, etc. For instance, Dai's text, The Legends of Pensam, published in 2006, a collection of 19 stories, which is an account of the life of Adis, a conglomeration of various ethnic subgroups of the Tani people inhabiting the central belt of Arunachal Pradesh in the districts of East Siang, Upper Siang, West Siang, Lower Dibang Valley, and Lohit Namsai is one such literary work from the Northeast which does not deal simply with the seemingly real or bigger issues of militancy and ethnic strife, but also narrates the tales of the Adis living on the periphery amidst the lush valleys of the state, which is a renowned biodiversity hotspot, housing a diverse range of flora and fauna, and is one of the most fragile ecosystems in the world. Recently, Arunachal Pradesh has also become a site of constant social, political, and economic change. Certainly, these are the changes perforating a society which has always lived in close communion with the natural world that the legends of Pensam documents, showing especially the difficulty that the Adi tribe is facing in remodeling their lives within quote according to the demands of the changing times, unquote. Now, to have in discussion Temchula Ao's short story collection, These Ales Called Home, Stories from a War Zone, again published in 2006 by Ao Naga Indian author Temsula, originates from a land still in turmoil. In Ao's short fiction, the actual struggle of the communities remains a backdrop. The thrust of the narratives is to probe how the events of that era have restructured gradually. The impact of climate change is intensely depicted in the story titled The Pot Maker by Temsula. So this is just one story I'm discussing from Temsula Ao here. From a different angle, where Arnela, a skilled potter, refuses to teach her daughter Sentila the craft of pottery because it is no longer an economically viable activity in their village. There is tension, constant conflict between Arnela, who despises her traditional craft, and the untutored Sentila, who yearns to make pots like her mother. The women of this village, Chanki village, were renowned for making
Sorry
sturdy
to
pots.
interrupt you, ma'am, but you need to sum up as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Okay, just a minute or two. So sturdy pots, and in the distant past, there were parties who, spared this village from attack just because these tribes were living there and they were making such good pots. So we see that, how the cultural traditions of a particular region are disappearing and vanishing just because in the name of the confusion, chaos in the outside world, because of the developments of globalization, and how it is also affecting the climate change, and also the question of human rights. So I'm skipping the other one. So briefly to point out, in Legends of Pensam, there is also a story, Daughters of the Village, where the people are just cursing the kind of unbalanced environment they encounter. So it's all a picture of soil erosion, deforestation that these people suffer from, and how it has completely changed the ethos of the cultural life that they are leading. So people are just thinking that they have to just bear with all this that is happening, because they are put in a land where no destiny is supporting them, and their forefathers have landed them here. So although there are differences of boundaries, communities, and cultural issues in a kind of strict sense in Temsula Ao and Mamangdai, but being women writers of the same era, I would say that they share certain common concerns for climate conditions, which are actually influencing subtly human rights domain in their respective states. So to skip something more, to sum up, the literature of the recent Northeast writers exhibit vividly the planetary issues related to climate change through a reconciliation of scales of memory, knowledge, and experience. In a world where everything is globally interconnected, a sole focus on locality must be replaced by an ethics of connectivity that recognizes the process of deterritorialization as fundamental in assessing the global risk induced by climate change. And this is something that both the writers have done. Such reconciliation also brings up the potentiality of human imagination to move beyond the immediate images of self and engage with the non-human victims of the anthropogenic climate change also. Both Ao and Dai effortlessly reconcile the local and planetary experiences of climate change, emphasizing upon the importance of both a sense of planet and a sense of place. Though rooted in a geographically bound area of the Northeast, the narratives we can see portray an imaginative reach very beautifully, very poignantly beyond its pages, and we see how the local scales out from the local to the planetary. So with that, I would conclude my paper. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity.
Thank you, Vidya Joshi, for again a very interesting paper. This very idea of eco-cosmopolitanism is not an old idea, of course. It is rather new. And thank you for choosing these two very leading authors from contemporary Northeast literature. And particularly as you were, presenting your paper, one thing that struck me is how the faint line of demarcation between global and local is erased.
Yes.
And that is how your title is so interesting. That is sense of place and sense of planet. That is, though it is local, ultimately you are connected.
Yes.
Okay. So I remember that the phrase of EM Foster only connect. So we have to connect the
Only
local
connect.
with the
Yes.
global.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting presentation. Thank you once again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your
Yeah.
generous remarks. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, with
So
the permission of the chair, I now open the session for questions. And a quick reminder, since we're running a bit late schedule, I can only take 1 or 2 questions and then move on to the next sessions. Kindly cooperate. Okay.
Please, if there's anyone who is ready with the question, 1, 2 questions. Or even from the paper presenters, okay, if they're interested in raising questions. First from the audience.
Yes, Shomasri Shorkar has raised a hand. If you want to ask a question, please go on. Kindly unmute yourself and please proceed.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. My question is for Dr. Obro Paul. Am I audible?
Yes, you are very much audible. Please go.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was listening to your paper. Actually, it's an amalgamation of a question or a clarification or an observation both. From your paper presentation, I felt that you were concentrating on the disaster part rather than on the politics of politics of the third world country or the politics of the global south. But from my understanding, I have a bit of a question that do you want to suggest that this cyclone that you were concentrating on, that was primarily through the coastal regions of Bengal and Bangladesh, so is it like that it is something that it is already happening and that and already happening in the third world countries? What the global north or the rich countries are predicting that can happen, the displacement that it can happen in the global north, but it has already happened in the global south, or in along the coast of Bangladesh and West Bengal. Is it like, were you trying to make such suggestions? Like, I don't know if I'm clear what I have asked.
Thank you for this question. I don't know whether I will be answering properly to you, but I don't think that climate-induced disaster or climate disaster is just a global south phenomenon. It's a worldwide phenomenon. I think you have heard about the butterfly effect. So if
last time
what
in the
Pooja Joshi said
presentation itself, I heard.
Yeah. So no, that was a book called Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver. Butterfly effect is I don't want to explain that here, but if there is a butterfly clipping in one part of the world, its wings, there may be a disaster in the other part. So this is the basic concept. I don't want to dig out more. But Pooja Joshi said that every disaster is a global concept. We cannot say that this is global south and other things. In my paper, what I am suggesting is the convergence of disaster studies and migration discourse and eco-criticism. Definitely, this is a very controversial topic. And I can say when we talk about all these things, we include the different research papers that existing about the legal definitions or the accounts of migration, how ecological factors are embedded in it, or these all things are there. But in my paper, I don't want to concentrate on that. My paper is much more a kind of case study for this theoretical perspective that I'm proposing, that while reading eco-criticism or anthropocenic fictions, we can propose a conversion of these three different perspectives, because eco-criticism is completely with literature, whereas disaster studies and migration, these are different genre, theoretical perspective. So from that point of view, in this paper, if I concentrate on the global politics, which is related to global South, or the eco-politics, that will be writing 3 papers together, and the main notion of my writing will lost somewhere. So that is why in this paper I'm not concentrating on that. Particularly, my postdoctoral work is on GHOSH and South Asian literature. So I have another paper where I have talked about this post-colonial issues, this global South, and other things which is related to disaster. I hope I have satisfied you.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we are a bit behind the schedule, and I need to end here as far as this session is concerned. So thank you, Professor JOYJIT Ghosh, for chairing the session. And also big thanks to all the paper presenters for talking or presenting papers on the interconnected relationship between climate change, literature, and human rights. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. With that, yes, sir. With that, we come to the end of this session. And now moving on to the next session, it gives me immense joy and pleasure to have Dr. DEBDAS Roy, Associate Professor, Department of English, Vidyasagar University, Midnapore, Paschim, to be among us. And I request Sheikh Tariq Ali to kindly introduce Dr. DEBDAS Roy to the audience and get the proceedings going.
Hello, sir. Good evening.
Good evening to you.
First of all, I would like to thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation for chairing this session. Dr. DEBDAS Roy is currently an Associate Professor, Department of English, Vidyasagar University. He did his PhD on poetry and sermons at the Department of English, Vidyasagar University under the supervision of Professor Tirthankar Das Purokayasto. He has a fairly good number of publications to his credit. He is the chief editor of Middle Flight, a peer-reviewed journal approved by the UGC. Dr. Roy has authored 2 books. The books are Understanding Romantic Poetry, A Critical Reader, and Shakespeare in Focus, in commemoration of the quarter centenary of Shakespeare's death. Now I request Dr. Roy to take charge of the session. Over to you, Dr. Roy.
Thank you. Am I audible, Tariq?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
Okay, fine. First of all, good evening, my mentor, my senior, and my teacher, Professor JOYJIT Ghosh, JOYJIT. And thank you, Tariq, for introducing me precisely and for your kind words also. And also, good evening to Mr. Rick Shorkar, who happens to be the program coordinator of this session, if I'm not wrong. And Rick happens to be one of the wonderful anchors I have ever met. So good evening, good evening, Rick. And I also extend my cordial thanks to all concerned, especially honorable principals of the concerned college. And I take the opportunity to congratulate Dr. Shomit Kumar Maiti and Mr. Ananto Khada and all concerned with this webinar for rendering a great service to the academia. And I remember the previous seminar was graced by a great person, a great academician, Professor Scott Slovic. This time it is started with so many personalities, especially the keynote address by Professor Keries. I indeed feel honored to be a part of this meaningful and very engaging webinar on climate change, human rights, and literature. And we have, as I understand from the program schedule provided by you, we have 8 paper presenters during the session, and I extend a very warm welcome to all the paper presenters. And without further delay, let's get started.
Actually, permission of the chair, may I now call Tushar Kanti Kormokar, PhD research scholar, Vishwa Bharati, and assistant professor of English, Kaliaganj College. The title of the paper is Violating Invisibly, a critique of slow violence in Ambika Sutan Mangar's Swarga. Mr. Tushar Kanti Shorkar, kindly start your paper.
Okay, Rick, would you please announce the time allotted for?
The time allotted for each paper is 10 minutes.
Okay, so if any paper presenter oversteps his or her time, please remind.
Yes, sir. Obviously, we will remind the paper presenters if there is any.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's get started.
I think Tusharkanti Kormakar did not join, so you can move to the next paper presenter.
Okay, Rick, would you announce the name of the next paper
Yes, sir.
presenter?
The next presenter is Laboni Sarkar, a PhD research scholar, Raiganj University, Raiganj, Uttar Dinajpur. The title of the paper is Anthropocentric Capitalism, Ecological Thought and Crisis, Perpetual Deterioration of Climate Change in the works of Arundhati Roy and Amitabh Ghosh.
She also did not join the program. So
Okay, in that case, I would like to proceed to the next presenters. Amrita Talukdar. She is a PG student, Department of English, University of Calcutta. Women in Rural India, Lack of Agency and Climate Change. Ms. Talukdar, kindly proceed with your paper, please.
Yes, sir. Sir, would you please tell me if my screen is visible?
Yes, it's visible. You may proceed.
Okay. So thank you so much for giving me such an opportunity to present here. Today I'm going to talk about women in rural India, their lack of agency and climate crisis. So as you all know, especially after having such a long day discussion on climate change, that our earth is now afflicted by one of the greatest maladies, and that is climate change. According to climate science, there are two types of climate change. The first type of climate change occurs due to the natural climate cycles over the decades, causing a natural drought, flood, increasing temperature, decreasing temperature, etc. And the second type of climate change is anthropogenic climate change, which is completely based on human activities, more specifically on our carbon footprint. As we all know, the consequence of this climate change constitutes a serious impact, throwing insurmountable challenges to us. But in this case, the livelihoods of the poor people are mostly affected. And the reason is that they have less access to the resources that are necessary to deal with the detrimental effects of a changing climate. But surprisingly, these climate-related challenges have disparate and disproportionate impacts on men and women. Such gendered impact on climate degradation is readily evident in rural India, where women suffer the most. Interestingly, in this anthropogenic climate change, women contribute less than men. But during such a disastrous weather event, women in rural households, the women's voice has either been ignored or silenced in the decision-making process. But what is the reason? Is it only their biological location that is responsible for such kind of plight? No. They become vulnerable not because of their biological location, but rather because of their gendered position in which they lack social, cultural, financial, and technological agency in our patriarchal society. Now, what is an agency? An agency is the power to express your free self with the ability to bring about a change. In other words, an agency is a powerful abstract idea that defines one's self-efficacy to meet their demands. Undoubtedly, this agency is multidimensional and context-specific. But unfortunately, in our India, the term agency bears its spontaneous association only with the men, as they are always perceived by the constructed societal norms as the heads of the households, local politics, and the leaders of any developmental regimes. On the other hand, the roles and rights of women are always already codified in such a way that they hardly receive access to finance mechanisms, updated technologies, social capital, and most importantly, proper education and training for climate adaptations. Moreover, climate change policies are mostly formulated based on gender aggregated data, which doesn't help to design the right solution for these rural women, and thereby the entire community suffers. Women's resilience to climate change is threatened by many kinds of inequalities, preventing them from participating in developmental processes. Apart from their predetermined gendered roles, the female body of these village workers has often been exploited and more particularly reconstructed by the man-made agency. A recent report has showcased that in the Bid district of Maharashtra, more than 13,000 women working in the sugarcane fields have no womb, as it throws them towards many complications during their work in the field. If they need to take a day off from the cutting sugarcane, they must give compensation for 500 INR, as it is determined by the industrial agency. It has often been seen during the menstruation period or pregnancy. Female sugarcane cutters cannot reach their target production. Even the male contractors associated with sugarcane fields also express their reluctance to employ those menstruating bodies. Many of those women have very often suffer from drastic health hazards like vaginal diseases, infections, or even cancer as a result of menstrual unhygienic conditions. To get rid of such complications, 36% of the female under 35 to 40 ages had already undergone the surgery called hysterectomy for removing their uteruses, as observed by the Maharashtra State Commission for Women 2018. They are often convinced by the contractors and the local doctors of their area that once they have the children, it serves no purpose to keep these organs. Now, how do women play an active role in to cope with the climate crisis? So women seem to be always in those rural areas uh, responsible for taking care of their children, spending for their family. And since the onus of ensuring food, they developed innovative strategies and came up with practical solutions. For example, a long-term study on some flood-prone villages in Faizabad, Uttar Pradesh, has shown that village women in India have the resilience to cope with climate risks. In my full paper, I have discussed about their strategies of storing food and how their expertise and knowledge of non-agricultural food sources help their entire family to deal with the exigencies of climate variations. Also, women from the village called Kotikud in Maharashtra, they use homemade concoction using Nirma detergent to kill the pests on corn. Even women active participation in holding livelihoods can be visible in the Sundarban areas of West Bengal, where most recently two devastating cyclones like Amphan and Yas on the top of the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic have wreaked serious havoc on the people of this area. And their women, with their different cultivating processes, they have learned many non-toxic methods to control the pest. For example, they use sex pheromone trap technique where the insects get trapped using their own hormones as a defensive mechanism. Again, water scarcity is a very recurrent issue in the many parched areas. And their women, is solely responsible for water management. Women's active participation in mitigating such acute water crisis is found in the Paipara village, Madhya Pradesh, and Podapathar village, Odisha, where a group of women has managed to improve the water and sanitation situation in their village by taking the help from the members of self-help group and an NGO. In doing so, what they face is that persuading men is not an easy task. They were not pleased with female leadership and increased participation of women in community activities. Now, why are women to be engaged in tackling climate challenges? Literature has frequently recognized that dominant socio-cultural gendered agency actively disadvantages those marginalized women. They are often projected as insignificant beings having no voice in their policies. But in India, the climate risks mitigation actions, programs, or projects can be more successfully implemented if these women are given a chance to raise their voices. Their accumulated knowledge and experience of natural resources undeniably would facilitate those policies concerned with management, rehabilitation, conservation, and environment. Therefore, first and foremost, girls and women from those villages should be given proper education. Educating them can bring up tremendous ripple effects to the entire society. Education will not only help them to navigate climate crisis, but it will secure their financial security, better health of them and their children. And most importantly, it will provide them with an agency in their family and also in society. As a result of education, they will become more resilient, adaptable, and will have opened more vistas to combat the crisis. Knowing the causes of carbon emissions and their adverse effects on living beings will lead them to choose alternatives to the use of fuels and firewood, saving the entire living system. Moreover, the Indian rural women need to be educated so that they can have better family planning. In most cases, these women conceive not by choice, but by chance. Reduction of the population is an urgent need to face the challenges of global warming. Essentially,
Sorry to interrupt, but kindly sum up.
yes, sir. Essentially, it will constrain future emissions of greenhouse gases by reducing the demand for food, electricity, and transportation. So all we need is gender equity in rural India, equal access to agriculture resources, farming, learning, technological domain, family planning, and most importantly, in the governmental projects and campaigns. The more women will be able to emerge from their subservient, subjugated, and suppressed lives, the easier it will be to find an ultimate solution. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Amrita. Really, yours is a well-researched paper. The kind of information that go into the making of your paper is astounding, very praiseworthy. I appreciate it, and you have taken a gendered approach to climate change, and you have traced its invisible gender effects in India. During any disaster, the death rate of women always remain higher, you have said in your paper. And also you have tried to trace why this happens. Definitely you have wanted to say, definitely this is not because of any biological reason. You have traced certain cultural, financial, technological agency. And some important points you have raised: fewer assets and rights, less access to ICTs, devoid of self-defense training, poor education, early marriage, healthcare and nutrition problem. All these are the root problems you have pointed out, nicely pointed out. And many of the inequalities, in society, because of they have been victimized because of the inequality prevalent in society. And you have pointed out a case from Maharashtra where around 13,000 women are without uterus. And, many information there. And from Sundarbans also, you have focused women from Sundarban areas etc. And you have ended your paper with a positive note. The note is that, yes, the note is that you have said that they should be provided with proper education that can cure the malady. So once again, thank you for such a nice presentation.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Amrita Talukdar. The next paper presenter is Harshita Manohar, a PhD research scholar, Department of English, and the title of the paper is The Swan Book, Climate Change and Aboriginal Rights. Please proceed with your paper.
Harshita Manohar will not be available for the presentation. She has already informed me that she will not be available.
So we would like to move on to our next presenter. And the next presenter is Shudipta Banerjee, independent researcher. And the title of the paper is Reading the Vulnerables, Human Trafficking and Climate Change.
From the list, I can see that she did not still join. So move to the next paper presenter.
Okay. So the next paper presenter is Tathagato Chondo, a research scholar, Department of English, Alia University, Kolkata. And the title of the paper is A Neglected History of Climate Refugees, an After Effect of Ruthless Hunting with reference to Jim Corbett's selected works. Mr. Tathagato Chondo, kindly proceed with your paper, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. Very good evening to you all, to the respected teachers.
Kindly unmute yourself.
Unmute and raise your voice.
Yes, he is audible. You need to raise your voice, right?
Okay, sir. So very good evening to all the respected teachers, my co-paper presenters. I would straight away go into my paper. My title, as Rick sir has explained, it's a neglected history of climate refugees, an after effect of ruthless hunting with reference to Jim Corbett's selected works. So basically, I have tried to divide my paper into three parts. The first part, that is a sort of a relationship, the relation that hunting bears with literature. In the next part, I have shown, particularly in the colonial era or the eras preceding it, how hunting had led to the destructions of the natural fauna. And in the last part, I have tried to show from some selected works of Jim Corbett, the renowned hunter, how far even he thought that hunting in the colonial era had caused destruction to the Indian forests. I'm beginning from my paper. Hunting wild animals as a declaration of elite authority is as old as empires themselves. Even the most common subjects found in cave paintings were large and wild animals, such as bison, horses, and deer, that is, especially those species that most often were suitable for hunting by humans. The very concept of the hunt itself has changed variously in Europe throughout ages. In ancient Greek myth and literature, the hunt was usually regarded as a just war, a triumph of the human and rational over the bestial and irrational. But throughout the Christian era, hunting has been viewed in an increasingly unfavorable light. During the later part of the Middle Ages, the hunt became an exclusive privilege of the aristocracy. In the Renaissance, the hunt became a symbol of tyranny and an object of moral indignation. From the 17th century onwards, the growth of anti-hunting sentiment has been linked in various ways to the growth of science. Science itself has called into question the moral foundations of man's dominion over nature by blurring the boundary between people and beasts. The romantic reaction against science has taught us to think of nature as a sacred realm opposed to the spreading pollution of technology. Conversely, the opposing Darwinian view of nature as a struggle for existence is often cited as a justification for hunting. In the Victorian era, Darwinism was also widely invoked to justify imperialism and laissez-faire capitalism. The big game hunting was embraced by European colonialists as a symbol of human dominion over the lower orders, and attacked as cruel and oppressive by the opponents of imperialism. Therefore, the hunt during the Victorian era was much more than a mere sport. It is the same period when Britain had most of its colonies flourishing throughout the world. The concept of the hunt therefore holds an important place in the history of colonialism. Hunting during the colonial period was much more than a mere sport. It was about control, discipline, and masculinity. The colonial period in India under the British Raj is no different from the other colonial rulers. In India, since the beginning of monarchy, the hunt has not only been the important medium of showcasing the ruler's privilege and power, but has also performed the function of training warrior classes in the art of combat. The British, like the Mughals, have followed similar kind of stratagems, where hunting and governance are bound together to meet the objectives of colonization as well as of pleasure sport. Under the colonial rule, what was a mere recreational sport in the later 18th and early 19th centuries became critical for the smooth running of colonial, political, and commercial functions and the extension of territorial control. In addition, the hunt also provided the colonizer a scope to showcase their manly prowess and superior martial and shooting skills. One of the most enduring and powerful images of the colonial period that has inspired awe and respect from both the local subjects and the British metropolitan audience was that of the white hunter or sahib standing over the carcass of a tiger holding a gun in his hand. During the Raj, hunting and fencing reflected the power and control of the colonizers. It portrayed the colonizers as someone powerful enough in not only chasing and hunting down feline animals, but also bounding and controlling forests by fencing it. Naturally, it struck fear into the hearts of the natives as well as the resistant subjects through the spectacles of a disciplined force. It portrayed the colonizers or the colonial hunter as superior with sophisticated weapons and skilled operative tactics as compared to the native hunters. This also helped the colonizers to establish themselves as the protectors of the indigenous populations. Therefore, hunting was not just a symbol but a method of rule. During the early part of the 19th century, the company government decided to clear areas of forest for cultivation purpose. This policy served them in two ways. First, they were able to deprive the locals from the rights to hunt and instead encourage them to turn to agriculture. Secondly, by using hunt as a ruse, they were able to conduct surveillance operations and were able to quell oppositions against their policies. Furthermore, it helped the colonial government's objective of maximizing the agrarian revenue and removing the natural resources of the colony. In order to make their work a lot easier, the Britons devised a shrewd hunting discourse, which led to the colonial construction of fear and terror of carnivores like tigers and leopards, as well as dangerous elephants and rhinos. They deliberately made these animals look like rogues in the jungles. Many imperial hunters were encouraged by the colonial government to dispatch troublesome man-eating tigers and leopards or destructive elements or wild pigs to protect villages and their agriculture base. The most prestigious trophy was that of the tiger. During the years 1877 to 1888, a sum total of 3,072 tigers were shot dead in India. Tigers were considered to be the supreme enemy of mankind, and as a result, even young cubs were not spared. Jerry A. Jalil writes in his book Under the Shadow of the Man-Eaters, during the same period, 6,796 leopards, 2,650 bears, 9,991 wolves, 2,619 hyenas, and 20,200 other game, including the elephants, rhinos, and lions, were killed by sportsmen. Even the colonial British government paid huge sums, near about rupees 10,000 as rewards annually for this slaughter. The bounty for a tiger was that of rupees 50. In due course, they gained the favor of the local populace and established themselves responsible rulers who looked for the well-being of their subjects. And by the end of the 19th century, the British were able to restrict hunting and sporting privileges solely to the ruling elite. Thus, in the entire process of fencing and clearing forest areas, hunting animals, the British had made hundreds and thousands of animals refugees in their own natural environment. By their ruthless hunting for pleasure sport and clearing forest areas for maximizing agrarian revenue and extracting the natural resources of the colony, the British were responsible for causing ecological imbalances throughout the country. Ramachandra Guha, in his preface to the first edition of The Unquiet Woods, Ecological Change and Peasant Resistance in the Himalaya, writes, the relationship between colonialism and ecological decline is one neglected by historians of modern India, who have been rather more aware of the social and political consequences of British rule. However, in Uttarakhand, by far the most important consequence of colonial rule was the system of commercial forestry it introduced. Yet, the conflict between state forestry and the peasantry, while perhaps at its most intense in Uttarakhand, was played out with variations in other forest regions of the subcontinent as well. With gradual decrease in forest lands and its after effects on the climate and the environment, the animals of the forest
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Chandu, but kindly make your concluding observations. Thank you.
okay, the animals of the forest, both carnivore and herbivore, were left with no other option than to come into contact with the human settlements just outside the fringes of the forest. Naturally, in due course of time, man and beast encounters became frequent, which resulted in fatalities. Now, Jim Corbett, throughout his career, he had tried to explain how a tiger, for instance, or a leopard, for instance, becomes a man-eater. There are several factors for it. The most obvious one would be a wound. The wound could be caused by while hunting other prey like a porcupine or wild buffaloes, or also by the shot from some amateur hunters, right? Now, apart from this, so what we could see is that with the slaughtering of the animals going on, the encounter between the man and the beast is becoming more and more frequent. Even in India, uh, there was a time that not only the people, that is the British or the outsiders, there were also local dealers who were still very much active. Those who also used to collect countless animals and birds at a mere price from the poachers. Now, due to the short time, I'm just very shortly, I'm just explaining certain facts. That is, in the memoirs of a court zookeeper published in 1982 by George Jacobs, he remembers such an animal market in Calcutta's hog market, right, where many endangered species were being collected. Now, uh, through his life, though Corbett, he always he was furious as at those hunters who would shot an animal and not and leave it injured, because this is the reason why animals in the first place they become man eaters. It is their when they have lost their efficiency to hunt, that is when they try and opt for easier prey. Other reasons is that diseases, when swept through the valleys, particularly in the parts of Uttarakhand, where the majority of the population is Hindus, so what they do is that they do not complete the funeral rites properly and throw these bodies on the edge of the from the edge of the hills. Thereby, any carnivore living in that area would grow a taste for human flesh, and when times would be normal, these would go to hunt for easier prey as it has developed a taste for it. Now, perhaps the biggest factor that has gone against the tiger is the commercially oriented forest policies that believes in planting one species of trees at the cost of destroying another for commercial gain. For example, the eucalyptus plantations in the Terai and Nilgiris and the confiners in the hills bear testimony to this. Now, to conclude, Corbett did whatever was possible to save the tigers in his later years. He gave lectures on wildlife at Nainital. Corbett's story of the People Pani tiger, which is now included in his Man Eaters of Kumaon, was first published in the Hog Hunters annual volume. His second dated writing was published in the Review of the Week of 31st August 1932. It was entitled Wildlife in the Village, an appeal. Here, however, it would be unwise to say that Jim Corbett had only shot man-eaters. In his young days, he had shot animals just for the thrill of it. He has raised his voice but he was not among the first to do so.
Kindly draw your conclusion, Mr. Chandra.
Yes, sorry, it will just take 30 more seconds. Strangely, he has remained silent on the hunts that he has organized for the Indian Maharajas and Viceroys. However, we could conclude by saying that he did fight for the denizens of the forest and had explained plight of these man-made refugees and how far we are responsible for the imbalance in the natural environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tathagato. First of all, before commenting upon your paper, I would like to thank you for your baritone voice. You know, at first it was low, it dramatically improved upon Dr. Shomit Maithi's advice and suggestion. So perhaps you had to leave many things because of time constraint, and Mr. Rick Shorkar is very particular about this, rightly so. He needs to be. Now, your paper is insightful. I enjoyed your paper, and you have divided your paper into 3 parts. In the first part of your paper, you have traced the relation between hunting and literature. Next, the relation between hunting and colonialism, and then you have focused on COVID. And while tracing the history of hunting, you have focused chiefly on Victorian period, which I find very interesting. So many things you have mentioned. Hunting was embraced by the colonizers. It was a sport to them, and not mere sport also. Then you have said it's a means of colonial control also, you have said. And rulers' privilege, hunting and governance, you have related. You find that hunting is also a means of control and governance. That is interesting observation. And hunting presents them as superior, and also a method of surveillance. So many things we have said, it's not possible to recount everything you have mentioned, but you have given a kind of hunting statistics of the Victorian era. And then upon you coming to COVID, you have said that COVID raised a very pertinent question: why tigers turn man-eaters? Because of their hunger. And your reaction, your take on COVID is a mixed kind of.
Yes.
Yes, I so far I understood. And he's silent on why Maharajas would hunt tigers.
Yes.
So overall, your paper is wonderful, nice. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chondo. Next, we have Dr. Rima Ghosh.
Dr. Rima Ghosh did not join, Mr. Rick Shorkar.
Okay, in that case, I would like to call on our our next presenter, Shomasri Sarkar, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Ghoshpukur College, University of North Bengal, West Bengal, India. And the title of her paper is Capitalist Exploitation, Climate Change and the Poor in the Himalayas, Appropriating Multi-Species Justice in Anuradha Roy's Drowning in Rivers. Ms. Shorkar, kindly proceed.
Yeah, thank you. Without much delay, I'll begin with the paper. As the title of the paper has already been said, Capitalist Exploitation, Climate Change, and the Poor in the Himalayas, Appropriating Multi-Species Justice in Anuradha Roy's Drowning in Rivers. In the current decade, we are no longer oblivious to the climate crisis and its impact on the Earth systems, entangling human and non-human beings both. The issue of climate change has gained greater currency within the socio-political debates and academic discussions since Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stomer's proposal of Anthropocene in 2000 as the new geological epoch. Crutzen and Stomer suggest that the Earth has entered into the Anthropocene, the geology of mankind. Crutzen opines that Anthropocene is human-dominated, which perhaps started in the latter part of the 18th century when analysis of air trapped in polar ice showed the beginning of growing global concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane. This happens to coincide with the beginning of the European Industrial Revolution, the most important invention being that of Watt's steam engine in 1784. Anthropocene has therefore embeds the implication of the beginning of the capitalist fossil regime, which has initiated the intra-species inequality.
Sorry, ma'am, unmute yourself.
So sorry. Was I not audible throughout?
No, it was very much audible in the first part. It's just during the last 1 or 2 seconds.
Okay. I think it just happened by mistake. Anthropocene therefore embeds the implication of the beginning of the capitalist fossil regime, which has initiated the intra-species inequalities in the current geological epoch. Andreas Malm and Alf Hornborg offer a critique to the concept of Anthropocene for its homogeneity, overlooking the unequal human subjectivity due to the existing economic gap between capitalist communities and their subjects. Later, Andreas Malm, in his work, The Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming, designates the term Capitalocene to the current geological epoch and says, this is the geology not of mankind but of capital accumulation. Similarly, Rob Nixon has also questioned the discourses on Anthropocene for marginalizing the questions of unequal human agency, unequal human impacts, and unequal human vulnerabilities, and he implores us to think about geological and sociological strata simultaneously. Such suggestions inextricably link the rise of capitalism with the concerns of climate change. The unrelented exploitation of the environment is an integral part of capitalism, which indeed is the manifestation of new modes of control and subjugation of the economically disowned community. The unequal human relationship is manifested through the enforcement of extraction ecologies, and I borrow the phrase from Elizabeth Carolyn Miller on the economically backward nations for colonizing the natural wealth by the rich economies. In such a hegemonic socio-political structure, the poor and the indigenous communities residing in fragile ecosystems are the most affected ones. The degradation of ecosystems has a direct impact on those dependent on their immediate natural surroundings for their livelihood, and the depletion of ecology inevitably disrupts their normal mode of living. This paper thus seeks to draw upon the discussions on capitalism and climate change in order to shed light on the victimization of the poor in the Himalayas. For this purpose, the arguments are contextualized in Anuradha Roy's short story, Drowning in Rivers, based on the fragile ecosystem of the Himalayas. The story concentrates on the dual victimization of the local inhabitants of the Himalayas by corrupt politicians and capital mongers. Underprivileged communities reliant on the vulnerable Himalayan ecology are evicted from their land and deprived of a healthy way of life for the economic activities of dam construction, deforestation, which result in consequences such as water scarcity, decreased rainfall, and increase in climatic temperature. The locals are forsaken for the so-called developmental activities, which in reality cater to the accumulation of capital. The author focuses her story on a Himalayan small town called Teri Garhwal, and the author states succinctly that a town with 100,000 population was washed off the map by the waters of a giant dam built there to supply electricity to cities in the plains such as Delhi. The lives of the inhabitants of the region are engulfed by the water released from the dam. This is a reminder of the Narmada Bachao Andolan in the 80s, a social movement carried out in favor of the river and the indigenous people dependent on the riverine ecology. Environmentalists like Medha Patkar investigated the resultant adversity of the dam's construction on the river. The discovered ground reality was startling, with no prior information given to those people likely to be severely affected by the dam construction. This indicates at the concoction of reality and the manipulation of the poor in order to carry out commercial projects. Such unprecedented geophysical changes not only alter the topography of the region but also create mass hazards resulting from the sudden evacuation of the region and toxification of the water bodies. The story in question highlights such an incident of mass evacuation due to the flooding of the hill town, uprooting thousands of the town dwellers. The forced uprooting of the people results in climate refugees, which is a problem in the current decades in the fragile ecology like that of the Himalayas. Research on the impact of climate change on human migration by the International Organization of Migration states that IPCC in 1990 has realized the greatest single impact of climate change might be on human migration with millions of people displaced. The complex problem of climate refugees is noted in Roy's story, capturing the angst and the existential crisis imposed on the town dwellers. The town, along with its history, submerged under the pressure of capitalism and consumerism. The complexity of the topographical change is multi-layered. The dam on one hand drowns the town, while on the other hand it turns another town into an island. The topographical change of the region alters the mode of living, degrading lives of the people. The town of New Theory, where the people are forced to migrate, turns into an island surrounded by a newly created lake without any land to grow vegetables, no forests to graze cattle, no streams to fish. The story is a critique of the lackadaisical attitude of the power holders who overlook the interests of the commoners and push them to the brink of death. The commercial exploitation of the poor and the environment is the reality of such a society, which is controlled by an invisible web of plutocrats and corporations. The systematic subjugation of the poor initiates the process of slow violence. Rob Nixon defines slow violence as a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space. The forcible disinheriting of a considerable population from their homes, thus rendering them homeless and depriving of their human rights, is also a form of slow violence whose impact is widespread, not confined to any time scale. The story highlights this impact of slow violence, which is categorically and systematically imposed on marginalized society. The slow violence is directly related to the deliberate environmental depletion by the capitalists who victimize humans and non-humans alike. The capitalist exploitation of a section of human beings and non-human beings deny them multi-species justice, which is a coinage by Ursula Hesse in Imagining Extinction. She she introduces the idea of multi-species justice that claims the well-being of both human and non-human situated in different cultures and biomes. As in the short story, Roy writes about the foxes and flying squirrels that have vanished from the Himalayan locality due to the climatic changes in the region owing to the increased commercial activities. The authors question, could an animal's sense of home be so fragile that the slightest change in its environment sent it scurrying elsewhere? Hints at the vulnerability of the non-human beings amid the anthropogenic practices that degrade their environment and force them to abandon their abode. The disenfranchisement of underprivileged human beings and vulnerable non-human beings are entangled in their common fate of forcible dislocation, which eventually endanger their livelihood. At the same time, these vulnerable entities in the fragile ecosystem are conflicted against each other, which complicates the chances of reconciliation. The paper thus, through an analysis of Roy's narrative, proposes that the unequal human agency in fragile ecology complicates the question of economic strata and the human-non-human relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sri Sarkar of GHOSH Pukur College. A very good paper. Rick, I was saying that during the session, we may have a few number of papers, but all the papers are really interesting. And the last paper presented by Somashri Sarkar is in tune with the other papers. And while commenting upon the multi-species justice in Anuradha Roy's Drowning in Rivers, you have touched upon so many points. And you have said that we are no longer oblivious of the disasters. Academic discussion is going on, and we have entered the Anthropocene, and you have well critiqued the idea. And then very important observation, well known, but still it is very important, that this climate change coincides with the beginning of industrial revolution. Yes, indeed it is. And also you have spoken about the unequal human agency, unequal human impact, and so many things, and unrelented exploitation of the economically disadvantaged, disowned community. That is, and in your paper you have spoken or dwelt greatly upon the poor and the indigenous community in the Himalayas. You know, the first paper was focused on the gender aspect, and your paper is in the poor and the economically disadvantaged. Though both the papers complement each other. Interesting. And you have also spoken about victimization of the poor on the Himalayas. You have said fragile ecosystem, dual victimization, and how their lives are engulfed by water from the dams. And you have rightly focused on the ground reality of their lives, and how for commercial projects their lives have been endangered, displacement. And very importantly, you have referred to the question of climate refugees, to which Amitabh Ghosh also refers in the Great Derangement, also in the Not Mixed Curse. And your paper ends with the question of slow violence and fragile ecosystem. So I appreciate your paper. It's a nice one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Shobhasri Sarkar. Do stay on for the question and answer session. Now, after consultation with the organizing secretary and with the permission of the chair, may I now request Ms. Labani Sarkar, who could not present her paper earlier, to kindly present her paper. And the title of her paper is Anthropocentric Capitalism, Ecological Thought and Crisis, Perpetual Deterioration of Climate Change in the Works of Arundhati Roy and Amitabh Ghosh. She is a PhD research scholar of Raiganj University. So, Ms. Labani Sarkar, kindly proceed with your paper, please.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Yes.
A very good evening to the respected program coordinator, sir, and the chairperson, sir, and all the paper presenters and the participants of this webinar. The title of my paper is Ecological Crisis and Thought Against Anthropocentric Capitalism, Perpetual Deterioration of Climate Change in the Works of Arundhati Roy and Amitabh Ghosh. Global anthropocentric capitalism has been creating environmental deterioration for the last 3 decades, as well as it has been silently halted human mobility through the degradation of ecological diversity. The perpetual growth of industrial infrastructures and deforestation causes the lives hazardous of indigenous people, as well as it creates the flows of unending migration of both internal and external in the sense that is the cross borders, the rise of gradual global petrodollar economy and the use of fossil fuel increases the ramification of crises, mitigation, disasters and hazards. It affects economical and social democratic rights of countless individuals. The particular and general in the sense of all over the world, climate changes increases global warming, as well as it creates a substantial stress on our lives and on the environment also. The journey of environmental degradation has been started since colonial period, and it has been continuously going on. It creates a crisis and it cautions to the modern human beings and their mechanistic attitude towards nature. The modern man treats nature as a source of resources, that means the spices, trees, sugarcane, opium, and fossil fuel, etc. This materialistic anthropocentric attitude towards nature creates a great derailment of existence of others. Here others means the non-human animals of flora and fauna. The ecological crisis has been originated from the perspective of the exploitation and destruction of nature by human beings, and it has been started during the progression of modern society and through the use of science and technology in day-to-day life. So this ecological crisis due to climate change asks us to imagine other forms of shelter in a utopian planet for human existence. In recent times, in literary fields, there are so many literary dignitaries who are very much concerned about the detrimental effects of climate change, and they start to write the issues of climate change for increasing the awareness among the people. We have seen a positive approach in Indian society, and they have started to note down all the issues regarding climate change. They are leading a role of eco-friend, quote unquote eco-friend, and they are leading a role of reformist of climate change. They are Bandana Shiva, Medha Patkar, Arundhati Roy, Anita Desai, Mahashita Devi, and Amitabh Ghosh. They make a literary canon where literary intellectuals raise voice against the deterioration of climate change. In the novels of Amitabh Ghosh and Arundhati Roy, we see the post-colonial eco-critical thought and a strong protest against the degradation of environment due to anthropocentric material needs. Amitabh Ghosh is the only Indian who talks about the concept of terraforming. Now, what is terraforming? Terraforming a science fiction that demands other planets. He talks about anthropocentric material attitude towards nature and the dilemma of Western and Asian countries, as well as he delineates the colonial rulers' exploitation of land through their aggressive imperialism. In his work, we are introduced to the massacre of Morithapi, exploitation of Banda Island, and by colonial leaders and contemporary climate change. His famous works are The Hungry Tide, The Nutmeg Crisis, Parable for a Planet in Crisis, The Great Derailment, Climate Change, and The Unthinkable 2016, and many more for the detrimental effect of climate crisis points out. Arundhati Roy is another Indian novelist who describes the exploitation of microcosm of ecosystem and natural object. So her works, The God of Small Things, Can We Leave the Bauxite in the Mountain, The Greater Common Good, deals the ecological crisis due to the anthropocentric activities. In this paper, I would like to discuss critically the works of Amitabh Ghosh and Arundhati Roy that delineates their concern about the climate change. So, in The Great Derailment, Climate Change and Unthinkable, Amitabh Ghosh delineates the direct modes of political and socio-economic organization towards the deterioration of environment as well as his concern about the climate change. He points out human beings' failure in literary world, history, and politics to focus on the flake and severity of climate change. He says that the past is hidden in present. The events of today's changing climate in that they represent the totality of human actions of a time represents also the terminus of history. Derailment means a state of mental disturbance and disorientation or the act of disturbing the mind. Here, Ghosh stresses the need for human beings to fight against the derailment of climate change and restore the earth for our future generation. He invokes the entire businessman, political leaders, scientists, and each and every individual to fight against the environmental issue. Not only developmental countries in America and Europe are much responsible for this global warming crisis, but also Asian countries are also the biggest contributor to recent climate change due to increasing industrialization. So GHOSH is commenting on the moral paralysis condition of global politics, and she urges to a collective measures of human being as the politics of sincerity. So Amitabh Ghosh, another novel, The Nutmeg Scouts, delineates the geopolitical construction of imperialism of Western countries at Banda Island, and it affects the lives of indigenous people. We see that materialistic Anthropocene used nature as a source of resource, and anthropocentric materialism treats nature where art and its creation exist as a resource, and human beings deteriorate the environment by using these. In this novel, GHOSH discusses that the nutmeg journey from its native Banda Island through the colonial mindset of exploitation of human life, and it sheds light on a widespread imperialism. It increases the migrant crisis in the colonial history. Climate change and global warming are the sin of human being, and the shadow of that sin always haunted human being. So the novel offers a sharp critique of Western society, and it makes a remarkable ways where human beings learn from their past. Now, Arundhati Roy's novel, The God of Small Things, depicts the patriarchal society's materialistic exploitation of nature and natural objects, as well as she invokes to global citizens to build a symbiotic relationship with nature. Her voice raises for the protection of microcosm of ecosystem that is part of the natural environment, the moon, the sky, the trees also. She writes how the river Narmada is polluted by the anthropocentric activities. Many years later, as Rahul returns, she finds the river welcoming her.
Sorry to interrupt you, ma'am, but you need to sum up.
Okay. So, Arundhati Roy, another essay, The Greater Common Good. Arundhati Roy points out how the rivers affected by the Big Dam. She writes, ecologically they are in the doghouse, they let the earth to burst, the coast floods, waterlogging, salinity, they spread disease. This is mounting evidence that links big dams to earthquake. So human beings are nature as a source of their need, and they forget that nature can take revenge. So Can We Leave the Bauxite in the Mountain, Roy delineates how materialistic modern human beings destroy substantially Earth's balance through mining. So the human-centric climate change makes a crisis as shown the development of global capitalism, and Amitabh Ghosh's apologetic attitude towards the developing countries creates a new revolutionary arena where human beings able to locate the central tenet of today's climate crisis. Arundhati Roy presents in her work delineates the anthropocentric activities of human beings, and she succeeds presenting an eco-critical perspective through humanizing nature in her works. Thank you.
Sir, please unmute yourself. I have muted your microphone because it was creating some background noise.
Yes. Thank you, Samit. Lavani, it's good to see that you have discussed a great deal Amitabh Ghosh's Nutmeg Scouts 2021 novel, the latest work. And right, you have said that fossil fuel aggravates the crisis. Exactly. And you have rightly said that the problem begins with the process of colonialism. So it is colonial modernity which is the root cause. It is behind the problem. Amitabh Ghosh has said it, and you have also referred to opium. In his novels, he has commented upon that, And also you have mentioned the names of many climate activists, also like Medha Patekar, Arundhati Roy herself also. And you have well explored or expressed the idea of terraforming. And Banda Island is there. Since nutmeg curse, you have fairly dwelt upon nutmeg curse, Banda Island. That's very interesting, I find. And finally, this observation of GHOSH, which is much discussed one, the past is hidden in the present. Yes, that is, I mean, taking the colonial history into account. And so he says, GHOSH says that the derangement is a state of mental derangement and disorientation, GHOSH says, rightly you have said. And he accuses the, I mean, there should be, he says that politics of sincerity, it should be there to solve the problem. And finally, you have dwelt upon GHOSH, who makes a sharp critique of the human society, and Arundhati Roy makes a critique of society, but patriarchal society, you have said. Right. So thank you for this
Thank you
nice
so much,
presentation. Over
Thank you,
to Rick.
Thank you, Ms. Lavani Sharkar, for this presentation. Now, before we break for the session, I would like to call out the names of the following persons, the following paper presenters: Tushar Kanti Kormokar, Harshita Manohar, Shudipta Banerjee, and Dr. Rima Ghosh. In case they are present in this session, I would request them to kindly proceed with their paper, obviously with the permission of the chair.
Now, of course, you have done the right thing, Rick.
If any of you are present in this room. Okay, I think nobody.
No, there is none.
Yes. With that, we come to the end of this session. Now, with the permission of the chair, I'll open this session for questions and discussions. I think we can have a couple of questions before.
Yes, of course.
The participants can ask their questions directly to the paper presenters, or the paper presenters can converse among them in terms of questions.
Questions or yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I have a query. Actually, it's not a question to Mr. Tathagato Chandu. So it's very interesting paper. I, from my limited reading of hunting literature, I think that hunting literature from India can contribute immensely in the corpus of environmental literature from our country particularly. So I hope you have read about Professor Mahesh Rangarajan's books. Those are indispensable. So mine is just a query. I hope that this is, or I presume that this is a part of your PhD thesis. So very wonderfully presented, the literature survey portion. My query is that, are you only concentrating on like Jim Corbett or some particular bioregion, like the Himalayan bioregion? Or you are looking at other writers also in your study?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, I'm also looking on Kenneth Anderson, sort of a comparison with Jim Corbett. That is both writers, one belonging to the colonial period and the other after it. And my topic for my thesis, it's slightly different from the paper that I have presented. It is more on how or why what Jim Corbett did. Was he himself a product of this colonial period, or whatever he did he did it from the core of his heart, for the goodness in his heart, for the people of India?
Yes, thank you. Like, actually, I was wondering that if you were including Kenneth Anderson. I have read heavily. Very wonderfully presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Is any more questions? Okay, I think with that we can safely conclude this session. Thank you, Dr. DEBDAS Roy, for chairing the session, and also to the paper presenters for presenting papers within the rubric of our, seminar's central theme, webinar's central theme. So with that, we come to an end, and may I now request Dr. Shomit Kumar Maiti to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Rick Sarkar, the program coordinator of this webinar. Now, good evening, everybody. As the organizing secretary and convener of this 3-day international webinar on climate change, human rights, and literature, I, Dr. Shomit Kumar Maiti, take this opportunity to extend my hearty thanks and deep sense of gratitude to Professor JOYJIT GHOSH, Department of English, Vidyasagar University, Paschim, Medinipur, West Bengal, India, and Dr. DEBDAS Roy, Associate Professor, Department of English, Vidyasagar University, Paschim, Medinipur, for accepting our invitation and for chairing the 6th and 7th technical sessions of this 3-day international webinar. My sincere thanks goes to all the 9 paper presenters this evening from different institutions across the country for sharing their valuable research experiences, findings, and perspectives on the issue of the literary representation of climate change and human rights. Our special thanks goes to all the students, teachers, and participants from the various colleges and universities who participated in this live program to make this event an enjoyable and engaging one. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shomit Kumar Maiti. With that, we come to the end of day 2 of the 3-day international webinar. A gentle reminder to all our participants that day 3 starts off at 7 p.m. in the evening. So do join us 10 minutes before the program starts. Till then, take care. Goodbye. You all have been a lovely audience. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.